Shattered glass rained down like jagged hail across the embassy courtyard, turning a quiet Tuesday into an absolute war zone. Captain Freeman scoffed at the quiet civilian nurse, rushing toward the catastrophic casualties, expecting her to panic. He didn't know Samantha Hayes was about to unleash classified top-tier trauma protocols that officially didn't even exist. Deafening silence always precedes the most violent storms, but inside the United States Consulate Medical Clinic in Bogotá, the morning was perfectly, almost painfully ordinary. Samantha Hayes sat behind a sleek metal desk, methodically sorting through inventory checklists. She wore faded blue scrubs that swallowed her athletic frame, her hair tied back in a messy utilitarian bun. To anyone walking through the reinforced steel doors of the clinic, she was exactly what her ID badge proclaimed: a civilian contract nurse hired to dispense ibuprofen, administer flu shots, and bandage the occasional sprained ankle for the bureaucratic staff. Footsteps echoed heavily in the corridor, the rhythmic, unmistakable sound of combat boots hitting linoleum. Captain Ayton Freeman strode into the clinic, flanked by two heavily armed Marines. Freeman was a man sculpted from military doctrine and sheer arrogance. His uniform was crisp, his posture rigid, and his eyes perpetually scanned the room as if judging everything he saw as inadequate. Nurse Hayes Freeman barked, leaning against the doorframe. He didn't use her title with respect. He used it as a subtle reminder of her place in the hierarchy. "We have a training exercise scheduled for 0900. I need your trauma kits inspected and signed off. Though, frankly, if things go south, my corpsmen will handle the heavy lifting. Just make sure the Band-Aids are stocked." Samantha didn't look up from her clipboard immediately. She carefully checked off the final box next to the saline bags before meeting his gaze. Her eyes, a piercing shade of hazel, betrayed nothing. The kits were inspected at dawn, Captain. Fully stocked. Standard issue. Freeman smirked, shaking his head slightly. Standard issue. Right. Just stay out of the way when the brass starts moving. Civilian contractors are a liability when the adrenaline kicks in. Noted. Captain Samantha replied, her voice smooth and completely devoid of the indignation he clearly wanted to provoke. She watched him turn on his heel and march out his men following in lockstep. Among them was Corporal Justin O'Connor, a young, bright-eyed soldier who offered Samantha an apologetic half-smile before disappearing down the hall. For the past 8 months, Samantha had endured Freeman's condescension. It was a calculated endurance. She preferred the underestimation. It was comfortable. It meant no one asked questions about the faint, jagged scar running along her collarbone, or why her reflexes were sharp enough to catch a falling scalpel midair without looking. She was a ghost, hiding in plain sight, seeking the quiet monotony of diplomatic healthcare after a decade of living in the shadows. But peace, especially in a volatile region teetering on the edge of cartel violence, is always an illusion. At exactly 9:14, the illusion shattered. It started as a low, rumbling vibration that rattled the medical supplies on their metal shelves. A fraction of a second later, a concussive shock wave ripped through the reinforced walls of the consulate. The sound was apocalyptic, a roaring mechanical scream of twisting steel and shattering concrete that blew out the clinic's bulletproof windows as if they were made of sugar glass. Samantha was thrown backward, her shoulder slamming into the sterile supply cabinet. The power grid failed instantly, plunging the room into chaotic, flickering emergency lighting. Sirens began to wail, a shrill mechanical screech that cut through the ringing in her ears. She didn't panic. Her heart rate, which should have spiked into the hundreds, settled into a terrifyingly calm, rhythmic beat. Muscle memory dormant, but never gone, instantly hijacked her nervous system. She grabbed her emergency trauma bag, completely ignoring the standard issue kits Freeman had mocked. Instead, she knelt by the floorboards beneath her desk, swiping a false panel away to reveal a heavy, matte black Pelican case. She pressed her thumb to the biometric lock. It chirped, the heavy latches springing open to reveal rows of silver vials, ominous-looking auto-injectors, and gear that had never seen the inside of a civilian hospital. Outside the clinic, the corridor was a nightmare of smoke and screaming. Status Freeman's voice echoed through the haze, ragged and panicked. "I need a perimeter. Where the hell is my medical team?" Samantha strapped the black case across her back and sprinted into the hallway. The western wing of the consulate had taken a direct hit from a vehicle-borne improvised explosive device. The reinforced perimeter had slowed it, but the structural damage was catastrophic. Debris choked the walkway. She found Freeman pinned behind a slab of drywall, his face smeared with soot, desperately trying to pull a severely injured man out of the wreckage. It was Corporal O'Connor. The young Marine was unrecognizable. His lower extremities were trapped beneath a massive steel girder, and dark arterial fluid was pooling around him at an astonishing lethal rate. The femoral artery was compromised, likely severed high up near the pelvis, making a standard tourniquet completely useless. "Corpsman, I need a damn Corpsman Freeman," roared his composure, entirely stripped away by the sheer brutality of the violence. "They were in the western wing." Captain Samantha said, her voice slicing through the chaos with unnatural clarity as she dropped to her knees beside O'Connor. "They aren't coming." Freeman whipped his head around, his eyes wide and wild. When he saw it was only the clinic nurse, his face twisted into a mask of furious desperation. "Get back to the bunker, Days. You are just a civilian. You cannot handle this. He needs a combat medic." Samantha ignored him entirely. She pressed her fingers deep into the junctional crease of O'Connor's groin, trying to manually occlude the severed artery. The pressure was immense, the young soldier's skin already turning a horrifying shade of translucent gray. He was rapidly bleeding out, slipping into profound hemorrhagic shock. "Listen to me," Freeman screamed, grabbing her shoulder and violently trying to pull her away. "You're in the way. You're going to get yourself killed, and you're going to let him die. Get out." Samantha didn't flinch. She turned her head, her hazel eyes locking onto the captain with a terrifying absolute authority that made him freeze. The quiet, subservient civilian nurse was gone. In her place was something entirely different, a predator in its natural habitat. "Take your hand off me," Captain Samantha ordered, her voice dropping an octave, laced with a glacial, unmistakable command. "Or I will break your wrist. Now get on that radio, secure the perimeter, and let me do my damn job." Freeman stumbled back, stunned, not just by her physical resistance, but by the sheer, imposing force of her presence. He watched, completely paralyzed, as the civilian unlatched her black case. Gunfire erupted in the distance, the consulate's surviving security forces engaging the secondary assault team, pushing through the breached perimeter. Freeman drew his sidearm, his tactical instincts fighting a losing battle against his sheer bewilderment. He couldn't tear his eyes away from Samantha. Standard civilian medicine dictates that in cases of severe, non-compressible torso or junctional hemorrhage, The patient is essentially doomed without immediate surgical intervention in an operating room. Freeman knew this. He had lost men to similar injuries in Fallujah and Helmand. You wrap them, you push morphine, and you watch them die. But Samantha Hayes wasn't doing any of that. She ripped open O'Connor's uniform with a pair of titanium trauma shears. "O'Connor, stay with me. Justin, look at me," she commanded, her voice steady, anchoring the fading boy to the waking world. "Cold!" O'Connor gasped, his eyes rolling back. "Cap, it's cold." "I know. We're fixing it," Samantha said. She reached into the black Pelican case and pulled out a sleek metallic cylinder that looked nothing like a standard IV bag. It was stamped with a faded, heavily redacted barcode and a biohazard warning. Inside was a hyper-concentrated, freeze-dried synthetic plasma combined with a proprietary nanogel coagulant. It was a DARPA-funded experimental substance known in Black Ops circles as Aegis. It didn't just replace volume. It actively sought out thermal signatures of internal bleeding and formed a rapid fibrous web to seal ruptured vessels. Freeman watched his jaw slackening as Samantha bypassed a standard intravenous line. Instead, she grabbed a heavy-gauge intraosseous drill. Without hesitation, she jammed the needle directly into O'Connor's sternum, pulling the trigger. The drill whirred sharply, punching straight into the bone marrow. "Jesus Christ, Hayes, what are you doing?" Freeman yelled, horrified. "You're going to kill him. Sternum IO access. Fastest way to systemic circulation when veins are collapsed." Samantha replied mechanically, not even looking at the captain. She twisted the cylinder of synthetic plasma onto the access port and squeezed, forcing the experimental coagulant directly into the Marine's central core. Within seconds, the massive, unchecked pooling of dark red fluid around O'Connor's hip began to slow. But Samantha knew it wasn't enough. The pelvic crush injury was too severe. He needed a mechanical occlusion. "Captain, I need you to put both your hands exactly here," Samantha ordered, pointing to a specific junctional pressure point on O'Connor's lower abdomen. Freeman hesitated, his military pride warring with the reality unfolding before him. "I do it now, Aton," she barked, stripping away any pretense of rank. The captain dropped to his knees, pressing his hands where she indicated. "He has no pulse, Hayes. He's gone. He has 3 minutes of viable brain activity left. Hold the pressure." Samantha reached back into the case and retrieved a sterilized package containing a long, incredibly thin catheter with a deflated balloon at the tip. It was a Reboa resuscitative endovascular balloon occlusion of the aorta. Placing one in a brightly lit trauma bay with an ultrasound machine was a feat of high-level vascular surgery. Placing one blind in the dirt under the flickering light of a burning building was considered utterly impossible. She didn't have an ultrasound. She didn't need one. Closing her eyes for a fraction of a second, she visualized the anatomical map she had memorized during her years embedded with a classified Joint Special Operations Command recovery team. She palpated O'Connor's opposite femoral artery, finding a faint, thready flutter. With a scalpel, she made a precise 2-inch incision, completely unfazed by the gore. "What is that?" Freeman choked out, watching her feed the wire into the young man's artery. "Zone 3 aortic occlusion," Samantha muttered, her hands moving with blinding mechanical speed. She fed the catheter up through the arterial system, judging the distance entirely by feel and resistance. "I'm blocking the main blood supply to his lower body. It'll keep his heart and brain perfused." She hit the mark. Grabbing a syringe filled with sterile saline, she inflated the balloon inside the aorta, effectively clamping off the catastrophic internal bleeding from the inside out. Instantly, the dying flutter in O'Connor's chest shifted. A sudden violent gasp escaped his lips as the remaining blood volume was forced upward into his vital organs. His eyes fluttered open wildly, looking around. Freeman let out a breathless, stunned exhalation. He fell back onto his haunches, his hands covered in grime, staring at the woman he had belittled just hours ago. O'Connor, who had been clinically dead 10 seconds prior, was now breathing. The bleeding had entirely stopped. "Hold this," Samantha said, handing Freeman the locking mechanism for the catheter. "If you let the pressure drop, the balloon deflates and he bleeds out in 30 seconds. Do you understand me?" Freeman nodded numbly. "I understand." Samantha wiped a smear of soot off her forehead, her eyes already scanning the hallway for the next casualty. The chaos was still raging outside, the staccato rhythm of assault rifles echoing through the compound. "Who?" Freeman stammered, his voice barely a whisper against the roar of the fire alarm. "Who the hell are you Hayes civilian nurses? Don't do blind rebos in the dirt. And they sure as hell don't carry DARPA tech in their duffel bags." Samantha paused, zipping the black case shut and slinging it over her shoulder. She looked down at the captain, the soft, unassuming facade permanently stripped away. "I told you, Captain," she said quietly, chambering a round into a discarded M4 rifle she picked up from the debris. "I'm just a civilian contractor. Now keep your hands steady. I have to go clear the hallway." Before Freeman could process the sheer absurdity of the statement, Samantha disappeared into the heavy black smoke, the weapon shouldered with the terrifying familiarity of a seasoned operator. The captain remained kneeling in the rubble, gripping the lifeline of his youngest Marine, finally realizing that the quiet woman he had mocked was arguably the most dangerous person in the entire compound. Acrid black smoke billowed through the consulate's ruined corridors, thick with the smell of vaporized drywall and burning circuitry. Samantha moved with a predatory grace that defied the absolute chaos swallowing the building. She didn't clear corners like a panicked civilian. She sliced the pie her footwork, silent the M4 rifle tucked tight into her shoulder pocket. The weapon felt like an extension of her own nervous system, an old violent friend she hadn't embraced in years. Down the hallway, the staccato bursts of automatic gunfire grew louder. This was no localized cartel strike. The breaching tactics, the coordinated suppression fire, the localized jamming of the consulate's radio frequencies, it bore the unmistakable signature of a highly trained private military company. They had a specific objective, and they were executing it with terrifying precision. Samantha slipped into an alcove as heavy footsteps approached. Two men emerged from the stairwell, clad in unmarked tactical gear, sweeping the corridor with short-barreled assault rifles. They communicated with sharp, silent hand signals. She took a slow, measured breath, letting her heart rate drop. In the world she used to inhabit, hesitation was the only true sin. Stepping out from the shadows, she didn't yell a warning. She simply raised the rifle and squeezed the trigger. 3 suppressed shots cracked through the smoke. The lead point man dropped instantly, his body armor entirely bypassed by surgical precision aimed directly at the unprotected orbital bone. The second man spun, raising his weapon, but Samantha was already moving. She dropped to a knee, firing 2 rounds into his center mass, then smoothly transitioning her aim to deliver a final definitive shot to his cranium before he hit the linoleum floor. The entire engagement lasted less than 4 seconds. Stepping over the bodies, she barely glanced at them, her mind already rapidly calculating the trajectory of the remaining assault force. But a soft, ragged gurgle from the adjacent administrative office broke her concentration. Kicking the shattered wooden door open, Samantha swept the room. Slumped against an overturned mahogany desk was David Miller, the consulate's chief of station. A stray piece of shrapnel from the initial blast had torn through his upper chest. He was cyanotic, his lips a terrifying shade of blue desperately clawing at his throat. His trachea was violently deviated to the right, tension pneumothorax. Samantha diagnosed instantly, slinging her rifle and dropping to his side. The trapped air in his chest cavity was crushing his heart and lungs. He had seconds before cardiac arrest. She reached into her scrubs, bypassing the standard civilian first aid pouch entirely, and unzipped a concealed inner compartment of her tactical vest. She withdrew a specialized DARPA-engineered decompression dart. It was significantly thicker than a standard 14-gauge needle and featured a one-way flutter valve designed for zero-gravity evacuation environments. "Hold still, David. This is going to burn," she stated, her voice unnervingly calm. She didn't bother swabbing the area with iodine. Locating the second intercostal space at the mid-clavicular line, she drove the heavy titanium dart straight into his chest wall. A loud, sharp hiss of escaping air followed, smelling of copper and trapped gas. Miller instantly gasped, his eyes flying open as oxygen frantically rushed back into his collapsing lung. "Breathe," Samantha ordered, watching his color begin to return. She slapped a vented chest seal over the entry wound, cementing it down with aggressive force. "Hayes," Miller choked out, his eyes wide with confusion as he stared at the heavily armed nurse. "What? How? Can you walk, David?" I think so," he stammered, gripping the edge of the desk. "Good. Take this." She stripped a sidearm from one of the neutralized mercenaries in the hall and pressed it into his trembling hands. "The primary safe room is compromised. Go to sub-level 2 maintenance corridor C. Lock the blast door. Do not open it unless you hear 3 knocks, followed by 2. Miller nodded dumbly, completely overwhelmed by the reality that the woman who usually checked his cholesterol was currently orchestrating his survival like a Tier 1 operator. Meanwhile, inside the fortified communications bunker, Captain Freeman was living a parallel nightmare. He had managed to drag the stabilized Corporal O'Connor into the reinforced room, locking the heavy steel doors behind them. His hands were completely stained, gripping the catheter lock exactly as Samantha had instructed. O'Connor was unconscious, but miraculously alive, his breathing shallow but steady. Freeman looked up at the bank of security monitors on the wall. The camera feeds in the western wing were dead, but the eastern corridor's night vision lenses were still transmitting. What he saw on the screen made his blood run completely cold. He watched Samantha Hayes, the woman he had berated that morning, for being a liability, systematically dismantle an elite assault squad. He watched her utilize cover reload with blinding speed and maneuver with a terrifying calculated lethality that only existed in the absolute highest echelons of Special Operations Command. She wasn't just surviving the attack, she was systematically hunting the attackers. "Who the hell are you?" Freeman whispered to the glowing screens, the weight of his own arrogance crashing down on him. On the monitor, Samantha paused near the heavy steel doors of the consulate's classified intelligence vault. 3 remaining mercenaries, heavily armored and carrying breaching charges were setting up to blow the vault's primary lock. They were completely unaware that death was standing 30 feet behind them. Freeman watched her drop her M4 rifle. It was empty. She didn't have any spare magazines. The captain's heart slammed against his ribs. She was unarmed, outgunned, and facing 3 men covered in ballistic plating. But Samantha didn't retreat. She reached back into the concealed pouches of her rig, pulling out a small metallic canister and a high-voltage defibrillator unit she had stripped from the wall of the intensive care ward earlier. Gregory Langdon, the mercenary team leader, pressed the detonator primer into the C4 explosive plastered against the vault door. He checked his tactical watch. They had exactly 4 minutes before the local quick reaction force scrambled from the nearby airbase. "Charges set," Langdon barked, stepping back and raising his hand to signal his men to take cover. "On my mark." He never gave the mark. A silver canister clattered across the linoleum, rolling to a stop directly between the boots of the 2 rearguard mercenaries. It wasn't a flashbang. It was a pressurized tank of medical-grade oxygen, its primary valve deliberately sheared off. Pure, highly volatile oxygen hissed violently into the enclosed, poorly ventilated space, creating an invisible, highly combustible cloud in a matter of seconds. Before Langdon could yell a warning, Samantha stepped out from the adjoining corridor. She didn't hold a weapon. She held the 2 paddles of the heavy-duty defibrillator wired directly into a bypassed capacitor she had rigged to overload. She slammed the paddles together. A massive blinding arc of electrical current snapped between the nodes. The spark ignited the hyper-oxygenated air instantly. A localized concussive fireball erupted in the hallway, consuming the 2 rearguard mercenaries. The blast wave threw Langdon violently against the steel vault door, shattering his tactical helmet and leaving him stunned, his ears ringing with a deafening screech. Through the settling smoke and the groans of his burning men, Langdon scrambled to draw his sidearm. His vision was blurred, but he saw the silhouette of the nurse walking toward him. She wasn't running. She was simply advancing an unstoppable force, closing the distance. Langdon raised his weapon, his finger tightening on the trigger. Samantha was faster. She sidestepped the wild shot, grabbing Langdon's extended wrist with a brutal joint-snapping twist. The gun clattered to the floor. Langdon, a giant of a man, roared in pain and threw a massive left hook, aiming to crush her jaw. Samantha slipped underneath the strike, with fluid efficiency driving her knee directly into his floating ribs. Bone cracked audibly. As Langdon doubled over, Samantha drew a sleek silver auto-injector from her pocket. It didn't contain morphine or adrenaline. It contained a classified weaponized derivative of succinylcholine, a massive paralytic agent designed to completely shut down the voluntary muscular system in under 3 seconds. She slammed the injector directly into the side of Langdon's thick neck, driving the needle deep into his carotid artery. The hydraulic hiss of the mechanism engaged. Langdon's eyes went wide with pure terror. He tried to swing at her again, but his arm froze mid-air. The paralytic hit his central nervous system like a freight train. His legs buckled instantly, his jaw slacking as every muscle in his body turned to stone. He collapsed onto the floor completely conscious, fully aware, but utterly incapable of moving a single inch. Samantha stood over him, her chest heaving slightly, her hazel eyes completely devoid of mercy. She kicked his sidearm away. "Code Blue," she whispered down at his paralyzed form. Suddenly, the deep rhythmic thumping of heavy rotor blades rattled the remaining glass in the consulate. Apache attack helicopters and heavily armed Black Hawks swarmed the airspace above the compound. The cavalry had finally arrived. An hour later, the courtyard was flooded with military personnel, medics, and federal agents. Floodlights cut through the settling dust, illuminating the sheer scale of the devastation. Captain Freeman stood near the rear doors of an armored medical transport vehicle. He watched as a team of specialized flight surgeons carefully loaded Corporal O'Connor into the back. The lead surgeon, a high-ranking military doctor, examined the makeshift Reboa catheter holding the young Marine's life together. The doctor turned to Freeman, utter disbelief plastered across his face. "Who did this, Captain? This is a Tier 1 surgical intervention. Whoever clamped this artery blind just saved this man's life." Freeman didn't answer immediately. He looked across the courtyard. Sitting on the tailgate of a shattered Humvee, wrapped in a foil thermal blanket, was Samantha Hayes. She had discarded the tactical vest. She was back in her torn, bloody blue scrubs, sipping a bottle of water, looking completely unremarkable. She looked exactly like a traumatized civilian nurse. A group of men in unmarked black suits and tactical gear approached her. They didn't bark orders. They didn't treat her like a bystander. The lead man, an older gentleman with severe eyes, handed her a secure satellite phone. She spoke into it briefly, nodded, and handed it back. One of the men carefully took the matte black Pelican case from the ground beside her, holding it as if it contained nuclear launch codes. Freeman walked over to her, his heavy combat boots crunching on the broken glass. He stopped a few feet away, suddenly feeling entirely out of his depth. "They told me I'm strictly forbidden from putting anything about the balloon catheter or you in my official after-action report," Freeman said quietly, his voice devoid of all its previous arrogance. "They said O'Connor was stabilized by incoming flight medics. A complete fiction." Samantha looked up at him, her expression unreadable. "Paperwork is a nightmare, Captain. Fiction is much easier to file." "O'Connor is going to make it," Freeman continued, his voice cracking slightly. "Because of you. You saved my Marine." "I did my job," Freeman shook his head. "Civilian nurses don't dismantle PMC hit squads, Hayes. And they don't carry weaponized paralytics in their scrub pockets. Who are you with CIA, Ground Branch, JSOC? Samantha stood up, letting the foil blanket slip from her shoulders. For a brief second, the apex predator looked out from behind her hazel eyes, a terrifying glimpse into a world of absolute, unapologetic violence that Freeman realized he knew nothing about. "I told you this morning, Eitan," she said, her voice a soft, chilling echo over the roar of the idling helicopters. "I'm just a civilian contractor. Make sure the Band-Aids are restocked for tomorrow." She turned and walked toward the waiting black SUVs, melting back into the shadows, leaving Captain Freeman standing alone in the ruins, finally understanding exactly who was really guarding the gates. If this story of hidden strength and classified battlefield brilliance kept you entirely on the edge of your seat, hit that like button and share it with someone who loves a massive plot twist. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss out on our thrilling real-life tactical breakdowns. Leave a comment below. Would you have guessed the quiet nurse was actually a top-tier operator? See you in the next video.